So we go with another country for today, and here we go with Poland. Sorry about that. So yeah, here we go. As the written history of Poland began in the 10th century, at that time Poland was ruled by a dynasty called the Piasts, and the Piasts named Majezeko. The first reigned from about 960 to 992. And in 966 he became a Christian and his people soon followed him. And a king named Boleslaw the Wrymouth, who reigned from 1102 to 1138, decided that after his death the kingdom should be divided between his sons, although the eldest son would have overall control, and that decision ultimately weakened Poland. And in the 11th century, 12th and 13th centuries, Poland prospered and kind of like town life started to flourish. And a king named Henry the Bearded reigned from about 1201 to 1238, and his wife Jadwiga encouraged German merchants and craftsmen to come and live in Poland. And they founded towns with German laws. And some Germans came to farm on cultivated lands in Poland. But in 1241 to 42, the Mongols invaded Poland. The Poles were defeated in the Battle of Legnica in April 1241, but the Mongols soon withdrew. Another threat from Poland came from the Teutonic Knights, who were the same order of fighting monks, and they set out to conquer the pagan peoples of Eastern Europe and convert them by force. In 1235 they began conquering the pagan Prussians, who lived in northeast of Poland, and by 1283 the Teutonic Knights had conquered the Prussians. However, in 1308 they returned on Poland, and they took eastern Pomerania, including a town called Gdansk, which was renamed Danzig. And yet in the early 14th century, Poland became a strong and unified state as Kazimierz III, known as Kazimierz the Great, reigned from 1333 to 1370, expanded east into what is now Russia, and also reformed law and administration. Furthermore, during the reign, the first university in Poland was founded in Krakow, as Kazimierz also protected and supported the Jewish population. And it was partly due to him that Poland came to have a large Jewish community. And from the 14th century to the 16th was it's kind of like a time of greatness in Poland, but the power of the king was gradually weakened and Polish nobility became more and more powerful, as Kazimierz was succeeded by his nephew Louis, the king of Hungary, and Louis wanted his daughter to succeed as ruler of Poland, but in order to obtain this agreement, the Polish nobles, he was forced to grant them concessions, and the privileges of Korzeniec from 1374 made the nobles exempt from most kind of tax, and he also gave them an important role in government, and in future no important decision could be made without their consent. And in 1384 the Polish nobles finally accepted Louis's daughter Jadwiga as Queen of Poland, as they arranged for her to marry Jagiello, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, and the two countries became allies, as Jagiello became Władysław II of Poland and reigned from 1386 to 1434, as Władysław joined the Catholic Church and people soon followed. And in 1910 Poland and Lithuania defeated the Teutonic Knights in the Battle of Grunwald. And then in 1453, the people of Pomerania rebelled against the Teutonic Knights and appealed to the Poles for help, and after 13 years of fighting, the Poles took Pomerania and Gdansk. However, in the late 15th century, the Polish nobles became increasingly powerful and the monarchy so weak. And in 1505, the king agreed that no political changes would be made without consent of the nobles. And in the 13th century was an age of economic prosperity in Poland, and furthermore, learning flourished in Poland, and some of the greatest Polish scholars like Nicolaus Copernicus from 1473 to 1543. And in his day, people believed that the sun and the planets orbited the Earth. And in 1543, Copernicus published a theory that the Earth and other planets orbit the sun, and at the time it was revolutionary. And like the rest of Europe, Poland was rocked by the Reformation, and Polish Protestants were divided into Lutherans and Calvinists. And in the 1560s, the Jesuits arrived in Poland, and they created a network of schools and colleges across Poland, and they managed to get rid of Protestants and all that. And nonetheless, the Compact of Warsaw in 1573 allowed the freedom of worship in Poland. But in 1569, the Union of Lublin, Poland and Lithuania formed a federation with the same king and parliament but separate armies and legal codes. When the last Jagiellonian king died in 1572 without leaving an heir, the Polish monarchy became elective. The king was elected by assembly of all Polish nobles, and in 1596 Warsaw became the capital of Poland instead of Krakow. And in the 17th century was kind of troubled time for Poland. And at the time, the Poles controlled the Ukrainian Cossacks. But in 1648 they rebelled, and in 6 years later, in 1654, the Russians joined them in a war against the Poles. And in 1655, the Swedes invaded Poland and overran most of it. However, the Poles rallied, and the war with the Swedes ended in 1660, and the war with the Russians ended 7 years later in 1667, but the war left Poland devastated. And apart from the material damage, a large part of the Polish population had been wiped out off the face of the earth. And in the late 17th century, Poland scored some military successes, and at the time Turks ruled southeastern Europe, and he tried to drive further into the continent. However, in 1673, a Pole named Jan Sobieski was elected king, and in 1683 the Turks laid siege to Vienna, but Sobieski defeated them and drove them back. However, by the late 17th century, Poland scored some military successes, and at the time the Turks ruled South. And by the late 17th century, Poland was severely weakened by a lack of an effective central government, and a single member of a Sejm could veto any measure. And furthermore, a single member could dissolve the Sejm, and this meant all measures were passed by the Sejm and were cancelled, and they resubmitted to a new Sejm. As a result, the government was paralysed. Continuing into the 18th century, Poland continued its political and military decline as Prussia and Russia took advantage of a strong central government to interfere in Poland. And in 1697, Frederick Augustus of Saxony became king of Poland. When he died in 1733, a Russian army marched into Poland and compelled the Sejm to elect his son king. Increasingly, Poland was a plaything of great powers. And in 1764, after the Polish king died, Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, intervened to have her former lover, Stanislav Poniatowski elected a new king of Poland. However, Poniatowski refused to be a Russian Poland, and he and a number of other prominent Poles wanted reforms to strengthen the monarchy, and the Russians would not allow it, and it was Russia's interest to keep Poland weak and divided. However, there were many conservative Polish nobles unwilling to surrender their privileges. And in 1767, Russians forced Poland to accept a treaty. The treaty guaranteed the borders of Poland, and it also guaranteed the rights of Orthodox Christians, although most Poles were Roman Catholics. A small minority belonged to the Eastern Orthodox Church. It also guaranteed the rights of Polish nobles, and Russia would intervene if their rights were threatened. As the nobles' rights kept Poland weak and without a strong central government, so it was in Russia's interest to protect them. And anger at Russian interference led the Polish uprising called the Confederacy of Bar between 1768 and 1772, but the Russians did eventually beat the Poles, and the great powers Russia, Prussia and Austria decided to help themselves to Polish territory, as Prussia took Pomerania, northern Poland, cutting Poland off from the sea, and Austria took Galicia, and Russia took what is now eastern Belarus. And this shock of losing much of their territory galvanised the Poles into action, as they reformed education and the army, and also reformed their government, and their 4 years Sejm from 1788 to 1792 created a new constitution for Poland in 1791. But in 1793, the second partition, Russia and Prussia took more Polish territory, and the 1791 constitution was annulled. And in 1794, the Poles rebelled, but they were crushed by the Prussians and Russians. Finally, in 1795, Prussia, Russia and Austria divided the last parts of Poland between them, and the Polish king abdicated, and Poland as a state was ceased to exist. And in 1807, Napoleon turned some of the Polish territories into the Duchy of Warsaw, a French satellite state, and in 1812, almost 100,000 Poles fought with Napoleon against Russia. And in the Congress of Vienna in 1814, the great European powers divided the continent, as Poland was divided between Prussia, Russia and Austria, as Prussia took the eastern northern parts of Poland, while Russia took the centre and east, and Austria kept Galicia. And the great powers were not willing to restore Polish independence, and instead it created a semi-independent Poland, and the Russian part of Poland was made into the Kingdom of Poland. As the Tsar was monarch, but his powers were limited in the kingdom, and the kingdom had its own government and army, but the Poles were dissatisfied, and in 1830 rebellion broke out, and some Polish soldiers attempted to assassinate the Tsar's brother, and the Polish Diet, or Parliament, declared the Tsar deposed. But however, the Russian army invaded, and by September 1831 the Polish army was defeated, and afterwards the Tsar suspended the Polish constitution and ruled by decree. The Polish army was disbanded, and as a result of the repression, many Poles emigrated to France or North America. As the Poles rebelled again in 1863, and the rebellion lasted for about 18 months, but was eventually crushed as well. And afterwards, the Kingdom of Poland was dissolved, and the area was renamed Vistula Provinces, as Russian was made the official language of government, and the Poles were forced to use it in schools, as a part of a policy to suppress Polish culture, and the Tsar had abolished serfdom, and the Prussians had tried to suppress Polish culture in the western part of the country, but could not, as Polish culture flourished in the late 19th century, and the Poles formed political movements including the Nationalist League, the Christian Democrats and the Polish Socialist Party. And Poland eventually regained its freedom after the First World War, and in 1916 the Germans conquered the Russian held parts of Poland, and curry favour with the Poles, the Germans promised to form Polish kingdom after the war. And meanwhile, Polish General Joseph Piłsudski from 1867 to 1935 led the Polish forces in the war against the Russians. However, Piłsudski fell out with the Germans, and in 1917 was interned. He was released just before the Russian-German surrendered on the 11th of November 1918, but in January 1918, US President Wilson made it clear his support for the independent Poland after the war. And on the 11th of November 1918, the day the Germans surrendered, the Poles took charge of their country and German troops were expelled. And on the 14th of November 1918, Piłsudski became provincial head of state, and in January 1919, the Constitutional Assembly was elected in Poland, and a new constitution was published in 1921. After the war, the Allies decided that Poland should have access to a sea, and it gave Poland a strip of land called the Polish Corridor, which cut through Germany, and it meant that East Prussia was cut off from the rest of Germany, as the Danzig or Gdansk was made an independent city-state. And in the early years, Poland fought border wars, and in 1919 fought a brief war with Czechoslovakia. However, a much longer war was fought against the Russians from 1919 to 1921. As well as the wars, the Polish Republic faced other problems, as in 1922 the President Gabriel Narutowicz was assassinated, and then in May 1926 Piłsudski led a military coup and became a dictator, as Piłsudski kept the outward forms of democracy and the Sejm continued to meet and political parties were allowed to continue. However, Piłsudski held the real power until his death in 1935. In the 30s, Poland was threatened by both Nazi Germany and Communist Russia, and in 1992 signed a treaty. Signed a secret agreement to divide Poland between them. And on the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Poles fought well, but on the 17th of September the Russians invaded the east, and the Polish position from then on was hopeless. But the Poles continued to fight back, and the Germans and the Russians. And on the 27th of September 1939, all resistance ceased. Fell on the 27th of September. No resistance ceased by the 5th of October. And some Polish soldiers and airmen escaped through Hungary, Romania to France, and some Polish warships escaped to join the British Navy, although the Polish army was reformed in France, and by the spring of 1940 it had almost 200,000 men, and the Poles also fought in the Norwegian campaign of 1940. And after the fall of France, in June 4th, 1940, Polish airmen played a major role in the Battle of Britain, and meanwhile parts of Poland were absorbed into Germany, and the rest of Germany occupied Poland was organised into a general government, and the Russian occupied parts of Poland were absorbed into what is now the Soviet Union. As the German-Soviet occupation of Russia meant a lot of suffering for the Polish people, and much of the Jewish population were killed off, and together about 3 million Polish Jews were murdered, and about 3 million other Poles were also murdered. And Hitler hated the Slavs, and he claimed they were subhuman, and the Nazis planned to turn the Poles into a nation of slaves who would do the menial work for the German masters, and the Poles would be given as little education as possible, and therefore vast numbers of highly educated Poles were killed off, and all Polish universities and secondary schools were closed, and Polish industries in the States were confiscated to Germans. And any act of resistance, however small it was punished by execution or by the execution of or by deportation to a concentration camp. No, but despite the tyranny, the Poles had a powerful resistance movement, and by 1943 the partisans were fighting in the forests of Poland, and the Russians imposed their own tyranny on eastern Poland, as thousands of Polish officers were murdered. And when Germany invaded Russia in June 1941, the Polish government in exile, which was led by Prime Minister Sikorski, made an agreement with the Russians, and on the 30th of June 1941 they signed a treaty in London, which ended the war between them. And it was Stalin promised to release Polish prisoners of war and a huge number of Poles who had been deported to Siberia. In Russia, there were almost 200,000 Polish prisoners of war, and they were released and allowed to form a Polish army in Russia. However, in 1942, Stalin cut supplies to the Polish army fighting in Russia, and they were evacuated to the Middle East. Furthermore, the relations between Stalin and the Polish government in exile deteriorated over disagreements over the border between Poland and Russia, and Stalin insisted that Poland's eastern provinces should be absorbed into the Soviet Union after the war. Matters came to a head in April 1943, after the Germans discovered the Katyn massacre. When the Russians conquered eastern Poland, they murdered about 4,500 Polish officers and buried them in the Katyn forest. And Russians claimed Germans committed the massacre after they invaded eastern Poland and Russia in 1941, and the Polish government in exile wanted the International Red Cross to investigate, but Stalin refused and broke all diplomatic relations, and Prime Minister Sikorski was killed on the 4th of July 1943 and was replaced by Stanislaw Mikołajewski. And however, Stalin was determined to impose the communist regime in Poland, and Polish communists were willing to cooperate with him. And the Poles realised that the Russians occupied Poland would simply impose their will on the country, and the only hope of preserving Polish independence was to stage an uprising in Warsaw before the Russians arrived. And the Warsaw Rising began on the 1st of August 1944. Although they fought bravely and all that, but they could not win, and were forced to surrender on the 2nd of October 1944. And Warsaw was left in ruins, and Stalin of course did nothing to help the uprising, and all he did was stand and wait for the Germans to win. And meanwhile, in July 1944, the Polish communists formed the National Committee of National Liberation, known as the Lublin Committee, and was led by Boleslaw Brewett. On the 1st of January 1945, the Lublin Committee declared itself a provisional government of Poland. And in February 1945, Stalin met Churchill and Roosevelt in Yalta and promised to allow free elections in Poland. And as usual, Stalin had no intention of keeping his promise. And the tragedy is now was seen as a tragedy that Poland was not liberated after the Second World War, and so had one type of tyranny. Like Nazism was replaced by another type of tyranny, communism. The provisional government was of course a puppet government controlled by Stalin. And at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, the provisional government agreed to the redrawing of Poland's borders. And the western borders were moved further west, and most of the Germans who lived there were expelled. And the eastern borders were also moved to west, and some territory was taken by Russia. After the Second World War, Poland was devastated, and the material damage was nearly about 25% of the population killed. And furthermore, communism was imposed on Poles, and communists took power in stages between 1945 and 1947. And at first, the provisional government was formed with communists in key positions, backed by the Soviet army, and elections were finally held in January 1947. But they'd been rigged and all. And as a result, the communists and socialists won a landslide victory as the so-called Democratic Bloc. And in December 1948, the Socialist Party was purged of its right-wing members, and the rest were forced to merge with the Communists. to form a Polish United Workers' Party. A new constitution was introduced in 1952 and Poland became an entirely communist country, as the communists nationalised industry but failed to collectivise Polish agriculture, and he also failed to break the power of the Catholic Church. And in June 1956, dissatisfaction with the communist regime in Poland led to riots in the city of Poznan, and the government crushed the riots by force, but the government realised some reforms were necessary. While in 1951, Władysław Gomułka, the first secretary of the party, was deposed and imprisoned, and in October 1956 he was released and the Polish communists made him the leader without consulting Moscow, and the Russians were enraged at the Poles and dared to take their independent action, and they came close to invading Poland. But Gomułka failed to carry out any fundamental reforms, and Poland stagnated under his rule. And then on the 12th of December 1970, the government announced massive food prices, and the results was a massive demonstrations and strikes in northern Poland, especially in Gdansk, as troops shot and killed many demonstrators, which only made it worse as the demonstrations spread. And in 20th December 1970, Gomułka was forced to resign and was replaced by Edward Gierek, who froze prices and introduced a new economic plan, and a peace returned. And Gierek borrowed heavily from the West, and as a result living standards in Poland rose. And in early 1970s, food became cheaper and the consumer goods became common. However, a rise in oil prices ended the economic boom, and in 1976 it was clear that the loans had been squandered, and Polish industry was unable to buy enough hard currency to pay back the loans. And the government introduced huge increases in prices of food, and the result was even more strikes, and this time the government ended the strikes by force, and many strikers were imprisoned. However, the Poles began to organise themselves, and in July 1980 the government announced a 100% rise in the price of some foods, and the result was strikes across Poland again. And in August 1980, the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk went on strike, and led by an electrician named Lech Wałęsa. The workers occupied the yards and drew up a list of demands, including freedom of the press, the release of political prisoners, and the right to form independent trade unions. On the 31st of August, the communists surrendered. Just go and see what's at the door quickly. Didn't quite need to. On the 31st of August, the communists surrendered, and they made the Gdansk Agreement and accepted the workers' demands. And the workers formed a solidarity trade union, which soon became a mass movement. But the communists soon fought back, and in December 1981, General Wojciech Jaruzelski imposed martial law in Poland, and solidarity was banned and its leaders were arrested, as Jaruzelski declared a state of war, but the war began the workers and the communists continued. And the economic crisis continued as Poland's debts grew larger and larger, as wages did not keep up with the price rises, and meanwhile the workers continued to hold strikes and the solidarity went underground. And eventually in 1988 the communists gave in, and Jaruzelski called for a courageous turnaround, and in 1989 the communists and solidarity held talks, and the government agreed to legalise solidarity and allowed freedom of the press. The communists also agree that the Sejm, or Polish Parliament, should be partly democratically elected, as communists would keep the 65% of the seats in the lower house, but the 35% would be free elected, and all seats of the upper house were to be freely elected. Elections were held on the 4th of June 1989, and Solidarity won 35% of the seats in the lower house and 99% of the seats in the upper house, and was pretty humiliating for the communists. And in August 1989, Tadeusz Mazowiecki became Prime Minister in Poland, and the communist tyranny was over. And in 1990, Welser was elected president, and in October 1991, completely free elections for the Sejm were held. But the new democratic Poland inherited severe economic problems from the communists. But Poland underwent the transition from communism to capitalism, and industry was privatised, and today Polish economy is growing steadily, and unemployment can be high but is falling. And in 1997, Poland gained a new constitution, as Kaczynski became president of Poland in 2005, and Poland joined NATO in 1999, and in 5 years later, in 2004, joined the EU. And quick little fact, Poland launched its first satellite, PWSat, in 2012, and the population today is about 38.5 million, as of about 2017. Moving on to language. The Polish language and culture has established a global presence, including 20 Nobel Prize laureates in the realm of literature, medicine and more, with a tumultuous history influenced by war and foreign occupation. The country of Poland has managed to maintain and massive purity and play a important role in the globalised culture, political and scientific spheres of the world today. Polish is closely related to both the Czech and Slovak languages, as Polish language is classified as a Slavic language within the European family of languages. And in the 6th century AD, the Slav people migrated from Old Poland and settled predominantly through Eastern Europe. There are 3 primary Slav language groups that emerge in the resettling process: Eastern, Western and Southern, as the Polish believed to have originated from the Western Slavonic language group. As the Polish language is based on the modern modified Latin alphabet rather than the Cyrillic alphabet, as Poland became a unified state in the 10th century, with varying tribes of people unified under a single ruler. And it's believed that the predominance of Roman Catholicism in Poland was responsible for the use of the Latin alphabet, which was a primary language utilized in writing the church texts in Europe at the time, as digraphs, in which a pair of characters are used to write a single sound, and diacritics, when a glyph is added to an existing letter, are used to convey sounds that cannot be represented by strictly Latin-based alphabet. And a said, which sounds like the English sh, sounds unique to Polish language. Diacritic is the L, which resembles the English W sound. As the oldest known evidence of written Polish appears in the form of proper names seen in Latin language documents from the 12th century. And examples of longer isolated Polish language writings, however, were not found until the 14th century. And in modern literary Polish, that were familiar today is believed to have developed around the 16th century. and the contemporary written Polish language was produced many renowned writers including Czesław Milos, Julia Hartwig, and Wisława Szymborska. And as a Slavic language, spoken Polish is distinguished by the fact that it is preserved nasal vowels, which are no longer found in other contemporary Slavic languages. Thanks to the use of its 7 vowels and 35 consonant sounds, Polish is known as a rich language phonetically, and Polish pronunciation generally places stress on the next to last syllable of a word. And like any other language, there are many diverse dialects within Poland, and prominent dialects in the northern area of the country includes Mazovian and Great Polish, where southern dialects include Little Polish and Silesian, and there's controversy surrounding the language dialects known as Kashubian, also spelled Kasubin. Although Kashubian evolved as a separate Slavic language, many people consider it to be a dialect of the Polish language. There's tension as to whether Kashubian should be classified as an independent language or a dialect of a Polish language. It exists to this day. And Polish has largely remained a pure language, although there is evidence of loan words borrowed from medieval German, Czech and Latin, and in more recent times English and French. And some Polish words like bakar, meaning a non-unruly boy or child, are borrowed from the Yiddish language. Owing to a significant Polish Jewish population in the country prior to World War II and Holocaust and all that. And surprisingly, Poland's close relationship with Russia throughout history, there are relatively few instances of direct borrowing from Russian language or in Polish, although most of those that do not exist are international use, such as the word Sputnik. And the Polish language has influenced other Slavic languages as well as German, due to Poland's proximity to Germany and Slavic-speaking countries, and some culinary words of the Polish languages have even been adopted internationally, such as the Polish word for dumplings, pierogi, and it's estimated about 43 million people around the world speak the Polish language. And Polish serves as the official language of Poland, where it exists as a mother tongue for about an estimated 38 million people. The language is also spoken in more than 1 million people throughout the Russian and former Soviet Union countries. And at least additional 1 million people in North America, primarily in the United States and Canada, also speak Polish. And the spread of the Polish population and languages continues to this day, mostly throughout Europe. And in January 2007, in an article in the UK newspaper, the Lancashire Telegraph reported English police officers were learning Polish to attempt to communicate with the influx of Polish immigrants in the area. And despite a rocky history of occupation, war and cultural suppression, Polish language culture has produced an impressive number of artists, thinkers and writers. Like the aforementioned 20 Nobel Prize winners, from poets to scientists, have been Polish in origin, including Czesław Milos, who was nominated and got the Nobel Prize in 1980 for literature, and then Walesa in 1983 for peace. And in 1475, the Polish language book to be printed in Poland was issued in Warsaw, and since then the Polish language has produced many globally recognized writers. As the influence of humanism and religious reforms in the 16th century produced what many academics consider to be a golden age in Polish literature. and the regaining of Polish independence in 1919 after years of divisions resulted in another highly productive period of Polish language literature. Although many writers did not gain prominent recognition for their work until after the Second World War, as Poland's wartime experiences and relationship with communism have proved to be prominent themes in much of the Polish language literature. So yeah, moving on to legends. As Poland has been a battleground between East and West, then crushed, bombed and ruled by unscrupulous and power-thirsty rulers, and its lands have soaked in blood and cities have been meticulously rebuilt on the bodies of those who died for them. And there's like a legacy steeped in murder, death and terror beyond belief, and it comes as no surprise that it reflects in the legends, and both urban and traditional, and several of associated with historical sites which can be visited, although sometimes not by a faint of heart. The first one is like vampires, like vampire graves. So surprisingly, as vampire graves are recognised by the positioning of a body in the tomb, as the vampires are buried face down in the fetal position, with their heads cut off and placed between their legs, with wooden and metal pegs and studs piercing their body, or in the grave held down by rocks, and many such graves have been discovered in different parts of Poland. And in Krakow's main square, researchers have discovered female skeletons laid in the fetal position. And Kazimierz Dolny, the body of a woman, was found with her hands cut off and placed in the mouth. And the most important discovery was made in Głowice during the construction for a new highway, as workers found several beheaded bodies, and the skulls placed between their legs, which was one of many ways to prevent the dead from returning. And it was an uncommon occurrence. Israel won the football, and those who managed to escape the earth would run around in circles like beheaded chickens, and ritualistic burials with preventative measures against vampires. And they're resurrected dead. Now moving on to chapel schools, as Zemena is a village in Lower Silesia in the far south of Poland, and the town has a small Baroque church with an unusual chapel. We also have about 3,000 skeletons of victims over 30 years in the Silesian Wars. The people who died of cholera, the plague, syphilis and starvation. Inside a crucifix are two carvings of angels, one with a Latin inscription that reads "Arise from the Dead." Construction of the so-called Sanctuary of Silence started in 1776 and was completed 18 years later, and the chapel was a collaboration between Czech priests Václav Tarasek and the local gravedigger J. Langer. And the crypt of chapel contains a further 21,000 bodies, presumably ones that did not get arranged before both artists themselves died, and the bones were dutifully added to the exhibit. And there's a black Volga that has been in the 1960s and 70s. A black limo roamed the streets of Warsaw, and the car was a Volga, which was typical to the communist elite, when the wheels were right and the windows adorned with white curtains. And it's said to have driven by a priest or a nun, and some even say the devil himself, and the driver would stop a passerby and ask for direction all the time, and then snatch the person, and the main children was prey. Inside the car there was a blood transfusion station, and the victim's blood would be taken to cure rich leukemia patients. And the urban tale has some Soviet origins, and it has been known as far away as Mongolia. And there's Wawel chakra, and they are said to have been had 7 centers, like the chakra in the tantric, the teachings of Hinduism. They're said to be a source of spiritual energy. I believe that one of those places was Wawel Hill in Krakow, specifically on St. Yeah.
Would you be alright keeping an eye on Clover then about 4:10.
Yeah.
He gets back here?
Yeah.
Be about half an hour or so?
Yeah, don't mind.
Okay, thank you.
I've got about 15 minutes till then. So yeah, St. is specifically St. Jerome's Chapel from the 11th century, according to legend. Greek philosopher, mystic and explorer Apollonius of Tyre discovered a hill with positive radiation, now called Wawel, during one of his voyages, and he left one of his talismans there, which unlocked the full potential of the chakra radiation. There's also the White Lady of Krakow, and the strange and tragic story associated with Krakow City Hall, and the legend has it that 200 years ago a priest was called to perform the last rites of a dying person, and he was taken to his clients by carriage, and once he arrived, the priest was taken to a chamber where he found a body covered in a cloak, and two people entered the room, an old man and a young girl dressed in white. The priest was told to perform the rites on the girl, and after the act was completed, the mysterious body emerged from under the cloak, dressed entirely in red, and turned out to be an execution and beheaded the girl. Later on the day, the priest found out that she was a young countess punished by her father for a romantic affair with a butler. Apparently the father buried her in the basement of the building, and since then the White Lady has guarded the halls of the mansion. Then there's a torture room of Andreas von Schlieben, and halfway between Poznan and Berlin there's a spooky castle turned hotel. There's a ghost of its former owner, Commander Andreas von Schlieben, was first spotted in 1820, and those who make his acquaintance nowadays are all men and visit the estates in the spring and summer, and guests have even have the choice of opting for a night of the torture room. This is with a huge solid wood bed. It comes complete with clunk manacles suspended from the walls and no escape bits and pieces. So it's not really for the faint-hearted. Then there's the devilish friends, Rokita and Bruta. According to legend, Rokita was a generous villain who lived with other bandits in Chobe Mountain, on Chobe Mountain, and would rob rich merchants and hand over the spoils to the villagers. And Bruta, on the other hand, inhabited the cellars of Mexica castle in central Poland, and he was a tall nobleman with a thick black moustache, and he wore a long overcoat to hide his tail and a hat to cover his horns, and his black eyes revealed his demonic soul, and each pole tells a different story about him. According to some, he was evil and mischievous. According to others, he was good, and for all intents and purposes, Rokita and Boruta were drinking buddies. And one night they were enjoying merry evening in the inn in Lutz, when the barman refused to sell him another pint. Rokita paid, but turned the coins into burning chips, and the owner was duly paid, but he couldn't take his earnings. And then there's a horrific face of Barbara Dunk. And in 1807, a fire ripped through the old time, and authorities blamed the town's eccentric maid called Barbara Dunk and imprisoned her for 3 years in the castle dungeons, and she was raped repeatedly and gave birth to 2 children, and nobody knows what happened to her. And she was burnt at the stake in 1811, and was the last woman in Europe to be burnt for witchcraft. And Roselle Castle is now an artist's hotel, and a guest regularly speaks of hearing stumbling and murmurs and strange footsteps, and even there were visits from ghost hunters international discredited the presence of supernatural forces in the castle. The nearby river called Sagina exhibited more worrying signs, and an entrance of an underground dungeon can be found where, with groans and yelps coming from inside, and a tragedy of the accident had a location in which a father and son had died when driving on a motorbike, and up until today the cause of the accident has not been discovered. And one last thing, we had demonic possessions in Wellclaw, in a main square, two townhouses from the Middle Ages, linked together by an overhanging archway of a couple holding hands, and some say this was Wellclaw's most romantic building. But under the archway there was once a cemetery, and the inscription read Mors Inua Vitae, death is the gateway to life. And this was the setting of horrid murder, as a grandson butchered his grandmother in a devilish frenzy, and he was said to have been possessed by a demonic dwarf who resided in nearby St. Elizabeth's Church, and according to the saying, some of the grandmother's shrieks can still be heard. So yeah, and a lovely way to kind of finish the video, so yeah. I'll say bye for now, and I'll see you all later on, so yeah.